Again allowed us to gather physically, to be here, to hear your word preached, to hear your word sung, to open your scriptures and study them. We also acknowledge there are those of our members who are away, and we would ask your continued protection and provision for them. Now, guide our thinking, guide our discussion as we enter this portion of your scriptures. We ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen. So let me welcome you to Grace Covenant Baptist Church, Monroe, on this 23rd day of July, 2023. Somebody asked me, said, why do you do that? Why do you give the date? Well, to give the date for the recording, it helps to keep things on track if you know the date. And particularly when this is our fifth session in this particular chapter. We've got probably two more, so we're going to have 6 or 7 pieces of this, and it just helps to keep it in sequence. Okay, we are beginning today. We're still in chapter 13 of 1 Corinthians, but we're going to start a new segment or a new pericope. We're going to start with verse 4. But before we get to that, remember in our last several sessions, Paul has been teaching us that without having learned to love, that we gain nothing. They were essentially put here to learn to love, and to live without learning that, we've wasted our time. So, no matter how impressive our other accomplishments may have been, without love, they don't amount to anything. So our next, as I said, our next section or our next pericope will start in verse 4, and we're going to get there in a minute. But let me make some introductory comments, and I've written all over my fingers with my pen. All of the descriptions that he gives us here, when he uses the word love or the term love, remember this is the kind of love that he's talked about in these first 3 verses. So when we say love, that's what we're talking about. But beginning here, there's a bit of a grammatical shift. If you remember, our first 3 verses begin with if. You remember, if is a third-class conditional which indicates possibility. Here, he gets to be a little more definitive, and he says, love is. This is a Greek construct where the verb is an active indicative. Active meaning the subject does the action, indicative meaning it's a statement of fact. So it begins to have the sense that this is a more active concept than perhaps what he was presenting in the first 3 verses. So, now verses 4, 5, and 6 are all connected. So we're going to take that as one single unit. We're going to take it apart, but we're going to look at it as one single unit. So, and remember, all of these verbs are active. So in that sense, love then becomes an action, not simply an emotion. And looking at it another way, all of these things he describe the ministry of Christ. If you look at it in that sense, it's the full and complete revelation of God as God and Christ dealt with imperfect people. So in that sense, we might also say love is a person. Okay, before we move on, just kind of with that introduction, one other introductory comment. Notice in these three verses, 4, 5, and 6, notice the conjunction and connects things. And notice the particle are. It's a negative particle, but in a kind of odd sense, it also connects things. And then one other grammatical note, look in verse 6. It says rejoices, and this is ESV. Other translations say something different. ESV says rejoices with the truth, not in the truth. Okay, so kind of file that, keep that in mind as we go through. So our first three verses that we've dealt with has been kind of theoretical, if you please. It's kind of been in the abstract. Remember, in concrete, not in the abstract. In the abstract, not in the concrete. But we've got another shift here because Paul here begins to talk. Whoa, whoa, whoa. The crowd went murmur, murmur, murmur. He begins to talk about some very practical things here. So we're moving from a more theoretical into a more practical application. So it's not, again, it's not love, this term love, this concept of love is not an ethereal idea that's just to be thought about. Now, having said that, there is a place for that. I agree. Some of us, perhaps, can remember those warm spring nights, not hot. Hot nights in Louisiana are not good for anything but growing cotton. Those warm spring nights with the full moon and the scent of honeysuckle in the air. Remember those? Okay, that's not what he's talking about here. He's talking about some very practical applications. It moves right down into the normal everyday experiences. So, going forward, as we read this chapter, or particularly as we read these three verses, it might be helpful if we ask ourselves some questions, if we do some diagnostic thinking. Okay, with me? You ready? I see some nods. I see some, and I'm not real sure. Okay, first diagnostic question. Am I growing in love? Now, we might say, in terms of growing, we might say maturing. Am I maturing in love? Now, the concept of growing and the concept of maturing both have the idea of some kind of progression, moving from one point to another. Okay? Now, if I think about that, am I doing this progression? What's the next logical question? Yeah, well, okay, yeah, why not? That's the negative. This is the thought question. What's the next? Huh? How or not why? Why is unanswerable. Yeah, in what way? How do I know? What are the markers? So, and this is not rhetorical. How would you know? What are the indicators? What are the markers?
This stuff. Actually listened to someone go over this week, and just like you said, it was a person. They did the same thing, and everywhere it says love or it says it in referring to love, the pronoun it, they put Jesus.
Yeah, hold on to that because we're absolutely going to get there. So,
Well, you know, if you're growing this, your place of love with not Jesus, but with yourself, if you're able to say, Casey is patient and kind, Casey does not envy or boast, and if you are able to pass all those tests, you know you are in fact growing.
okay.
But if you see where you fail, that's where you need to work.
Yeah, having trouble with my words this morning, to assess against this text. That's the frame. Now, inside the frame, how would you know? You ever thought about that? Exactly, but what kind? Anybody ever written contracts? I know Rusty has. Some of the others may have. When you write a contract, part of the contract is boy, I'm drawing a complete blank. It's evidences, it's statements of, I know this because this happens. I forgot the technical term. So what are the statements of evidence? How would you know? No response. Yeah, but how would you know? We're growing, we're maturing, we're in this continuum from point A to point B, and then beyond B. But when I get to B, how do I know? How do I know I'm there?
How do you know you're there perfectly?
No. We're not going to put that qualifier in there.
But how do you know you're growing and moving? Well, I'd say either one, you yourself are comparing 2 points on this line you just created with your hands, or someone else is.
Yeah.
But there's a comparison of points on this.
So somebody else would tell you maybe. Okay.
That'd be a good marker.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I'm gonna come back to that one.
Probably
But
more accurate than you yourself, and sometimes about yourself.
yeah.
Maybe, one thing that you certainly should do, Michelle's not here to defend herself, but we were covering this passage years ago, and she started praying for patience. And the month after the Sunday, she decided to pray for patience. She was stopped by a trainer 4 times at one time.
Yeah. Be careful what you ask for.
Exactly. God didn't give her patience, God gave her an opportunity to show her patience.
Yeah, we're going to spend some time with patience. I told Rudy and I think Lamar this particular passage has been really kicking me on the shins. That I am not a patient person. You know. I think.
You have some external validation.
Well, I knew that was coming, but you know, I think I'm better, but I am not patient, and we're going to talk a lot about that. So, okay, all right. Let me give you some other indicators. How about this one? Looking back over the past year or 6 months, you can put whatever time frame in it you want. Am I easier to live with now than I was then? A lot of qualifiers in there, you know, whatever easier means. But am I easier to live with now than I was 6 months ago or a year ago? Yeah. Our consensual validators are gone. Well, mine's not. Mine's still here. But okay, how about this one? Do I handle people more graciously and more courteously? That one is fairly easy to mark. I mean, there are some qualifiers, but that's pretty easy. Am I more compassionate? Am I more patient? So we're back to patience. So see, those are some of the behavioral markers that we can lay out. So yeah, you can check it. I'm gonna come back to that one as well. So in a sense, these are some measurements that we can use to measure our progression, our improvement, or hopefully not lessened, but or our life in general. It's a measurement tool. And we've seen that Paul has already said that holding up any other quality we may possess is essentially worthless if we lack this one. So this one becomes important. So remember, gosh, way back, first session where we started talking about the hows. How do you understand this term? How do you understand this concept? This is part of the hows. These are the hows that we can use to begin to make sense of this concept. And then Paul will begin to give us some very practical ways to assess this, and where we'll detail those. Okay, typically I do not talk directly to our kids. And I think you kids would agree with that. Typically I don't do that. When I was in practice, I did not treat kids because children and I do not speak the same language. So, having said that, with that disclaimer, I'm going to put a pause, I'm going to push pause, and I'm going to speak directly with the kids. Is it okay for me to use kids? That's not derogatory in any way. So I want to talk with everybody 18 and under. So how many 18 and unders have we got? Let me see a show of hands. 2. A little help back there. Okay, several. And as I said, Paul is going to begin to talk about what I would say are behavioral traits, both positive and negative. Now, you guys, 18 and under, you have a very distinct advantage over some of the rest of us who are older. And the reason you do is because the older we get, the more fixed, the more rigid our behavioral patterns become. So yours, you have them, everybody has them, but yours are not as set, as fixed as some of the others. The term that comes to mind is malleable. Anybody know what that means? Kiddos, anyone know what that means? Well, it means flexible. It has reference to soft metals, gold and lead. Now, I've never been able to handle gold much, but I have handled lead. You can take a strip of lead and it bends very easily. You can shape it, turn it, twist it, whatever. So it means flexibility or ability to be shaped. So having said all of that, you have the ability to adjust some of your behavioral patterns easier than, say, with an adult. So what I'm inviting you to do as we move through this is listen to these things that Paul is talking about. Listen particularly to the negative things that Paul is talking about, and then do some self-assessment. Is there anything in that I need to begin to alter, to adjust, to change? So. Now, that does not exclude the 18 and older, because I'm going to hammer you guys pretty hard. So. Huh?
We're not as malleable?
You're not as malleable. You're not. I'm not. We're not. Actually, I'm not going to do it. Paul's going to do it. So, I am parroting Paul. Okay, here we go. Beginning in verse 4. This is what he said. I'm getting feedback or echo or something. Where it says, love is patient, notice the conjunction, and kind. Love does not envy or boast, is not arrogant or rude, does not insist on its own way, is not irritable or resentful, does not rejoice in wrongdoing, but rejoices, ESV, with truth, others say in truth. So. Now, do you notice anything particularly unusual about these three verses? Okay, let me help you. There are only 3 positives. What are the positives? Let's find them. Yeah. Love is patient. Love is kind. And what's the third? Rejoices in truth. Now, what on earth does that mean? See how we read over stuff? What does it mean?
All of us are just under 18.
Huh?
All of us are just under 18.
Yeah, we're all together. All of you over 18 now, come back to here and now. We're going to do reality check.
I would say the conjunction of but is contrasting it with the phrase before, which gives us some understanding of what it means.
Yes?
You know, if you rejoice at wrongdoing, so if you're calling what is evil good, or if you're celebrating, in this case, personally, if you're celebrating people in sin or yourself in sin or evil or whatever the wrongdoing is, the opposite of that, rejoicing with the truth, are you celebrating the good?
Yes, exactly.
Fighting with those that do good things and honor God.
Absolutely. But what does it mean? I'm picking at you, you know that. Fundamentally, huh? You don't have to raise your hand. You have permission. Go ahead.
It seems like to me that love and truth are having a relationship here.
Absolutely.
Like a hand-in-hand walking together relationship.
Absolutely.
What they are doing is rejoicing, as in, as if there's like something even deeper, something even greater, something.
You're right. What is it? This is another thinking question. You can't just repeat this one. You can't regurgitate this one. Rejoices in or rejoices with love. What does that mean? You're overthinking it, guys. Fundamentally, it means honesty. So love is patient, love is kind, and love is honest. 3 very simple, and I put that in quotes, things. Now, we've got 3 positives. How many negatives do we have? I hear 8. 8 going once, going twice? Yes, there are 8 of them. Now, you mathematicians, help me here. If my math is correct, and I am not very proficient in math, we have about 2 1/3 more negatives than positives. Right? Somebody do that math for me. Is that close? Okay. Now we know things repeated are important, right? That's one of our fundamental concepts. Some things that are repeated in Scripture are important. So, if we've got more negatives than positives, why are they there?
We do them more?
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that, but that's correct. Yes. Why, Paul doesn't do anything by accident, of course. So why would he put all these in here?
Because he's trying to give us a better idea of what we've been considering okay. You understand this is not what I'm talking about.
Yeah, you're on the right track. So these negatives that Paul sticks in there, well, that's the wrong phrase, that Paul writes in there, is associated with his concept, or with this concept of love, because these are things that we have to set aside in order for the love of God to manifest itself. Because we know God's love is patient, it's kind, and it's honest. So these are the negative behavioral characteristics that we have to get out of the way to let that natural love manifest itself. Now, most of us live in a very producing environment. We're almost consumed with producing stuff. So my guess is that for some of you, for some of us at least, the I must kicks in. I must do blah, blah, blah. I have to not do blah, blah, blah. Or in other words, we have to begin to produce the kind of love Paul is talking about. Okay? You with me? We're on the same page. Would you agree with me? Sound like an attorney now. Would you agree with me that we cannot produce that kind of love? Okay, I got one assent. Why not?
God, it's not going to be love.
Hmm?
It's of God, or it's not going to be love. It'll be simply acknowledging what's so very good and nice for us to enjoy.
Okay, so
Goes without saying.
yeah, so it's of God. Just parentheses that. What else? It's contrary to our nature, yes. It's already there. If we're in Christ, that aspect, that love, that concept is already there. So A, we cannot produce it because God did. And B, it's not necessary. We do not have to produce or attempt to produce this kind of love in our Christian walk. Remember, I guess it was last week maybe, where we talked about understanding how to love God. Remember? I'm not going to do it again, but you remember? Lean into the mic. It's not hard, Jack. So what did we say all we have to do to love God? I mean, there's several facets, but fundamentally, all we have to do is to remember what he did for us. So this is kind of the same concept. All we have to do is get these negative things out of the way, and God's love, which is already there, can then begin to manifest itself. Okay? I'm seeing some, maybe the wheels are going, I don't know. Maybe there's some misunderstanding.
This is the equivalent of if you want to clean a room, you don't make it clean. You remove the junk.
To remove the dirt.
Before it's
Exactly.
clean.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a good illustration. I hadn't thought about that, but that's exactly it. It's not producing something. It's not making something. It's removing the interferences to the things that are already there. Not the typical way we think. So in a sense, what we're talking about, and Paul talks about this in other places and other writers do as well, but it's the concept of dying to self. So in a sense, this is a piece of dying to one's self. So this is part of what Paul has been telling us throughout this entire book. My original thought was it's a secondary theme or concept, but it's not really secondary. It's just not one of the primary things he talks about. It's kind of underneath a lot of the other things he talks about. That God is ready to love through us if we're ready to give up all of these hindrances. If we're willing to give up the negative expressions, and I'm going to blow your head up, that we enjoy. Now, don't go hyper spiritual on me here, and no, I'll never do that. Yes, you do. You know how I know you do? Because I do. We all do. And we're going to detail some of these in a minute, but it's fun. We enjoy it. There's only two reasons why we do anything. Ready for this one? This is one of them hard sayings. It's either useful, and I think we would also, most of us would agree that negative kinds of stuff is not particularly useful. Or the second reason is it's pleasurable. We enjoy it. And we do. Okay? So we know the perverse pleasure that we get out of some of these negative qualities, and we don't want to give them up. It's too much fun to rip somebody apart, figuratively, not literally, obviously. Here's one. It's too much fun to give them a piece of my mind. Sometimes verbally, but for us probably more often in our thoughts.
You justify yourself and say, I give them a piece of my mind because if I didn't, they would have no mind.
Yeah, we do all kind of gymnastics with that. So to make them suffer, put that in quotes, for all the injury or for all of the injustice that they've caused me. Been there? I think so, most of us. Okay, here's one of the favorites. This is a favorite in marital pairs. It's a favorite in high school and junior high kids and their friends. Freeze them out. Put the freeze mode on them. You don't talk to them. Don't associate with them. You let them, give them the silent treatment. You let them stew a little bit in their own juice. Say again? Yeah. Okay, ring a bell. Kind of aside to that this silent treatment is a form of emotional blackmail. Now there are other components to that, but it's a form of that. So we do these negative traits, these negative behavioral patterns, and we enjoy them. They're fun. They're not useful. We've established that. So the only other possible explanation is we enjoy it. So I think it would be safe to say that most of us want to be loving. That's our kind of our goal. That's where we're trying to go. But many times we first let our negative stuff, our flesh, if we want to put it in those terms, we let those predominate. That comes first. And kids, remember I talked earlier about adults, those guys some of us guys that are older than dirt. Those patterns are established. They're fixed. They're almost automatic. And it's extremely hard to change them. And the first step for change is what? Well, there's one before that. Recognition. You have to know there's a problem. So in this frame, I keep using that term. Y'all understand what I'm talking about when I say frame? It's a conceptual box, basically. So within this frame, we have to know that negative response is there. And we also have to know that it's going to pretty much automatically show itself. So, as I said, many times we let this negative stuff predominate, and that's one of the major reasons we don't experience God's love. Okay? So now we're getting down to the kind of the nitty-gritty. We're getting down to where the rubber meets the road. This is the stuff Paul begins to talk about or write about. So, what are some of the things that keep us from being patient? And by the way, patience as it's used here, always is in regard to people, not circumstances. Important distinction. So think about that and let me tell you a story. I told you I'm not patient. I'm not a patient person. It is one of my, and notice the phraseology, it's one of my favorite peeve for people who sit through a green light. Okay? Anybody been there? There is a particular light, if you're going east into Walmart's parking lot, that light is extremely short. At best, you can get 3 cars through it.
Or one
Huh?
text. Or one text.
Well, okay, there you go. So if the lead car is sitting there and they're doing whatever it is they're doing, my fantasy is they're texting for 30, 45 seconds to a minute, and I'm third in the line. Guess what happens? I don't get to go through the light. So, is that circumstance? Or is it personal? It's personal. My aggravation is with the person that's first in line doing whatever it is they do. So I don't get to go through the light. Nobody else does that, I'm sure. And my thinking is, it's almost as if I'm going through that light in a big hurry so I can turn into the parking lot at Glenwood's emergency room. Now, if it's a real emergency, I turn on my flashers, run the light, and go. It's not an emergency. I'm at best going into Walmart or probably going home from having done something else. So it's my own negative response to that circumstance It's my own impatience. Now, I probably don't know that person in that first car. So interactively with them is unlikely. But conceptually, that impatience interferes with my being a loving person toward them. So, one example. Give you one other. We hunted waterfowl. We hunted ducks. Because if you're a squirrel hunter, a deer hunter, or particularly a turkey hunter, you've got to be still and you've got to be quiet. Okay? When you hunt ducks, you don't. You can sit in the duck blind, you can talk, you can cut up, you can drink coffee, you can eat what you brought, or more likely what somebody else brought. And you don't have to be quiet. You don't have to be still. You don't have to be patient until the ducks get overhead. Then you got to quieten down. So because I'm so impatient, I didn't hunt turkeys. I would not sit still long enough to be a turkey hunter. So just another application. So again, being patient relates to people, not circumstances. The literal translation of patience is long-suffering. So the word means being patient with people so we don't immediately attack them, wipe them out, again, verbally, turn them off. Here's one that we often don't recognize, that we don't immediately jump in to solve their problems. And that's a whole nother discussion that I'm going to avoid. But our contemporary culture has trained what we know in the vernacular as helicopter parents. They hover, they circle around, hovering. And they jump in to solve their kids' problems, which in a sense is a dysfunction to the kids because they never learn how to solve problems. So that's a form of not being patient. Or more likely, we become impatient. We jump in because I'm impatient about something I want. I want to go through that light. I want to get wherever it is I'm going 30 seconds before I would ordinarily get there. So I get impatient. So instead of doing that, perhaps I should attempt to understand whatever the circumstance is and wait patiently for the other to work their problems out or to complete their thought. I invite you, kids and adults, to begin to pay attention as you're communicating with somebody. Am I listening? Or am I formulating my response? Am I striking a nerve here? Like I said, I've been really convicted about this patience thing, and I've been trying to monitor that. And I would, this is just guessing here, but I would guess probably 90% of what I do non-professionally. Now, in my professional life, you had to listen. Actually, you didn't. That's the fallacy. Probably 90% of what I do is formulating what I'm going to say. And guess what happens when you do that? So, I see some nods. Is that ringing a bell?
The better we know the person, sometimes the harder it is to do.
Yeah.
It's like in school, when you know this person, and as soon as they come in the door, I've already got my response before they even say anything.
Yeah. Hold on to that thought, because we're going to come back to that one as well.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but
patience, no, first, impatience seems like it's focusing on a points in time, how long it takes to get from this point in time to this point in time, as opposed to patience that focuses more on things that do not change, things that are eternal.
Yeah, that's the ideal. That's what we should do. Many times we don't. And that's kind of the concept Paul's talking about here. It's removing that negative concept that allows the almost said naturally occurring, that's not correct. The love of God that's already there to manifest itself. To remove what interferes with that. We love to interfere with stuff. I've told you this story before. I'm telling stories this morning, which I probably shouldn't do. I've told you this one before. When I was doing adult training, and we'd go into a workshop with some kind of, quote, new idea that state office came up with, and I would preface my presentation with, there are at least 15 ways that you can think of that this will not work. So let's put those aside and deal with whatever it is we got to deal with. So I really don't understand completely this concept, but we're trained with this negativity. And it just kind of bubbles up. Okay. So this is the beginning, and I'm running out of time, so we're probably going to stop here. But hey, I got a vote of assent. So this is the beginning of these negative things that Paul's going to talk about throughout these three verses, and we're going to detail all of them. So to begin to be more patient is to begin, first of all, to be aware that we've got these negative things that bubble up, and then begin to deal with them in a way that alters or amends, maybe a better word, the transactions that we're having with sometimes the environment. Now, there are environmental things that happen. There are circumstances that happen. I'm not excluding that. But primarily, it's interpersonal interaction. It's interpersonal reaction. And then it becomes incumbent on me to begin to adjust that to allow God's love to manifest itself. Okay, does that make sense? We're on the right track? Am I on the right track? Paul always is. So, okay, thoughts, questions, comments, objections, emendations, anything before we adjourn? There is a motion on the floor to adjourn. Do I have a second? So be it. Adjourned.